Brian Kimmett and Don Yeager, authors of Thomas Jefferson and the Tripoli Pirates, Andrew Jackson and the Miracle of New Orleans, the battle that shaped America's destiny. So, just to give you guys a rough idea, though, this is like the United States and the if you see New Orleans, that's like where Jackson, who will be our who was our seventh president, though, but not at this point in the book. Prologue. In the spring of 1781, the Redcoats arrived in Upland, Carolina, and they brought terror with them as they searched the countryside for rebels. They turned the region the Jackson family called home into an armed camp. Elizabeth Jackson's youngest son, Andrew, though barely 14 years of age, hated their presence and quickly learned just how costly to fight for liberty could be. On April 9th, Andy and his brother Robert, 2 years older, earned the wrath of the invading force by joining battle to defend the local meeting house against a band of Tories reinforced by British dragoons. The fight went badly for the Americans, but the brothers, unlike a cousin who was severely wounded and captured, were lucky. They escaped, and after spending a night hiding in the brush, the two Jackson boys managed to reach their cousin's home to deliver the news of his fate. Once there, however, their luck ran out. A Tory spy spotted their horses and informed the British of their whereabouts. A lesson in cruelties of war was soon delivered as the Jackson brothers stood helplessly at the point where British swords the enemy set about destroying their aunt and uncle's home. Determined to make an example of these rebels, the Redcoats shot the ditches, they ripped table clothing, they smashed furniture, then with the house in ruins, and the commanding officer decided upon one more humiliation. He chose Andy Jackson as his target. He ordered a tall, gangly Andrew Jackson to kneel before him and clean the mud from his boots. The boy refused. "Sir, I'm a prisoner of war and claim to be treated as such." Enraged by the young American's defiance, the British officer raised his sword and brought it down on Jackson's head. Had Andy not raised his arm to deflect the blow, his skull might have been split open. As it was, the blade gouged his forehand and sliced his hand to the bone. Not satisfying, drawing blood from Andy, the soldier turned and slashed his brother, tearing it into a scalp, leaving him dazed and bleeding. No one dressed their wounds. Instead, the Jackson brothers were marched 40 miles with neither food or water to join more than 200 other rebellious colonists in a British camp in Camden. They were fed stale bread and exposed to the smallpox that raged among the prisoners, kept in tightly packed conditions. Their mother, Elizabeth Jackson, had already lost too much. Her husband, Andrew Jackson Sr., worked himself to death shortly before Andrew was born, leaving the pregnant Elizabeth soon to be 3 young sons in the rugged wilderness of upland South Carolina. She had raised the baby and his brothers as best she could and tried to protect them from the dangers of the war, but the boys had joined the fight despite her pleas. Hughes, the oldest, had died at age 16 of heat exhaustion after about the year before. Elizabeth was not about to lose her remaining sons now. Traveling long distance to their prison, she managed to persuade the jailers to include them into a prisoner exchange. But freedom didn't mean safety. Robert had fallen seriously ill. His wound infected and the family of 3 had many miles traveled on just 2 horses. Robert, delirious, rode one, and the dogs did Elizabeth the other. Andrew walked. He made the journey barefoot since the British had taken his shoes. Although all 3 made it home through driving range, Robert died 2 days later. Elizabeth had no time to nurse her grief or her remaining son. As Andrew recovered from a fever, she set off for Charleston, where 2 other nephews she helped raise were prisoners. She would never return. After completing a 160-mile journey, much of it through enemy territory, she became ill with cholera. And died. Andrew would learn that he was an orphan when a small bundle of her clothes was returned to his home. Andrew Jackson would never forget the pain and humiliation that summer. His father, mother, brothers were dead. He himself bore the memory of the British brutality on his forehead and the hand forever, marked by the British officer's sword, a reminder of the callous cruelty that destroyed his family. His mother may have left him alone, but she had not left when without worse to live by. Years later, he would report that she had told him, "Make friends by being honest and keep them by being satisfied. Never tell a lie nor take what's yours own, nor so for slander. Settle the cause yourself." And wouldn't forget her advice, and he would take the care to settle more than just slander. Great Britain had left him an orphan, and one day he would settle that score, which is just saying like he's gonna be like a journal, like all in the army. I'm gonna settle a score, which is about at New Orleans, which even though the Treaty of Ghent was already signed, but like back in those days, news like traveled very slowly, so it took about like months. So technically, the war, which is of 1812, which this book is about, basically this is the last battle of that war in New Orleans. Maybe and also like some of the other battles that he was in. So yeah, and I don't know if you guys know this, but like Andrew Jackson was helped by pirates in the battle. And now, if you like this, please subscribe, leave a like, comment. Yeah, so I think I'm gonna I don't know, but I think I'm gonna make something for the opening though. I haven't decided yet, so I just got my Chromebook just a few days ago. Once I'm recording this, so yeah. So chapter 1. Freedom's at risk. There are the times with distinction that the real friend of his country from Talmadge Brawler and the Sunshine Patriot, the former steps forth and proclaims his readiness to march. On June 1st, 1812, which obviously is the war, which lasted a few years, America declared war. After a hot debate, James Madison, who is basically the father of the U.S. Constitution, though, which, he personally was at the Constitution Convention in 1787, where he saw George Washington, but basically presiding over the whole thing. War resolution was passed by a vote of 19 to 13 in the Senate and 79 to 49 in the House of Representatives, which is basically the Congress. And James Madison, I think at this point, is on the sixth president. No, not the sixth, but the fifth. Because I just forgot about John Quincy Adams. And once again, the new nation would be taking on the world's premier and economic power, Great Britain. "29 years had passed since the colonists, and proud of victory in the Revolutionary War, which we call the American Revolution, or just the Revolution. And for 29 years, the British had failed to respect American sovereignty. Now the nation, James Madison, had led to reach the limit of its tolerance. Great Britain's kidnapping American sailors, which is impressment when they did it, like during the Revolutionary War, and before then they'll also, ironically, they passed recently, passed a law, with this book. It's so old law in today's, but back then it was just recently passed, and this war was I think was a silly war though, for most people who fought and survived the American Revolution, though, stirring up the Indian tribes to attack settlers on the western frontier had made life intolerable difficult for many American second generation, including those hard scrabble men and women pushing the boundaries westward. They were reluctant to risk the new nation's liberty. Madison was now ready to send a message to England and the world that America would stand up to the bully and choose to do her harm. The unanswered question was, could America win? Less than 30 years removed from the last war, with virtually no national army, were Americans prepared to take Britain and defend themselves? This time without the help of France. The world was about to find out. In fact, so many Americans opposed the war that the Declaration posed a real risk to the country's national unity. The Federalist Party, which, back then Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, I think there was also, and also John Adams. They were a major political party during our when our nation was young, building up this nation to what it is today. Mainly representing Northerners who commonly relied on the British trade, had unanimously opposed the war declaration. Many New Englanders wanted peace with Britain, and it was likely that some would be willing to leave the Union in order to avoid a fight. Yet, peaceful attempts at resolving the conflict with Britain had already been tried and hadn't helped the economy much. 5 years earlier, when a British ship attacked the U.S. Navy's Chesapeake, killing 3 sailors and taking 4 others from the ship to impress them into service to the crown. Then President Thomas Jefferson, the third president, the second vice president, declaration, author of the Declaration of Independence, governor of Virginia, Jefferson then was most famous like for a few things: Declaration of Independence, the third president. I think that's about it. That's all I can think about. But like he did send basically his whole collection of books like to the Library of Congress. And that's all. And this is a little bit off topic about like well really, but and the main building is called the Jefferson Building, though. Thomas Jefferson had attempted to retaliate to protest this, but hostility Congress passed the Embargo Act prohibiting overseas trade with Great Britain. Unfortunately, the act hurt Americans more than the British. In just 15 months, the embargo produced a depression that cruelly punished merchants and farmers while doing little to deter the Royal Navy's interference and hardening New England's resistance to conflict. Further attempts at legislation pressure in the early years of James Madison's presidency. Had a little effect, and British impressment had continued. By the time of war declared in June of 1812, the number of sailors seized off the decks of American ships had risen to more than 5,000 men. Too many, including Andrew Jackson, then 40 years old. The attack on the Chesapeake alone had been an insult to American pride that demanded a military response. As Jackson wrote to a Virginia friend after learning of the Chesapeake's fate, the degradation offered to our government has roused every feeling of the American heart, and war with that nation is intolerable. Intolerable. Yet America had waited and the loss at sea mounted. At the same time, attempts to pacify Britain had only resulted in further losses in America's new territory, the West, which ran south to north from the Gulf of Mexico to Canada, bounded on the west by the Mississippi. The three British agents were said to be agitating the Indians. For many years, the five civilized tribes in the region, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Cree, and Snohomish, had maintained a peaceful relations with the European arrivals. But as more and more white settlers moved into native territories, tensions had risen and open conflict had broken out. In some places, travelers could no longer be certain whether the Native Americans they encountered were friendly for inhabitants of the frontier. That meant the events of daily life were accompanied by fear. Stories circulated of fathers who returned from a day of hunting to find their children butchered and wives who stumbled upon their husbands scalped in the fields. A major Shawnee uprising in the Indian Territory of 1811 escalated that fear, and as the bloodshed increased, there were reports that the British were providing the Indians with weapons and promising them land if they carried out violent raids against American settlers. For Andrew Jackson, the threat had become too close for comfort when in the spring of 1812, just 100 miles from his home, a marauding band of Creeks killed 6 settlers and took a woman hostage. Jackson was certain that the British were behind the attack on the little settlement at the mouth of the Duck River. I need to take another drink of water. Westerners like Jackson fumed on the government's inability to resolve the country's problems, but their clout in Washington, which is the capital though, not Washington State, which has not become a state at this point, was limited. The decision makers from Virginia and New England had little sympathy for their inland countrymen. Eastern newspapers poked fun at the hills folks' backward ways, and much of the territory of the west of the Appalachian Mountains remained mysterious and wild. With a few good roads and even fewer maps, the dangers faced by Westerners were not felt by Easterners, and their anguished demands for retaliation was scorned and dismissed by those whose wallets were to be hurt by the war. But eventually, despite many politicians' disdain for their hick neighbors to the west, Washington politics had begun to shift along with the nation's growing population. The West had gained new influences in the elections of 1810 and 11, where the region sent a spirited band of new representatives to the capital. These men saw British attitude toward the United States as a threat to American liberty and independence. They also saw the need for westward expansion, a move that the British were trying to thwart. Led by a young Kentuckian named Harry Clay, they quickly gained the nickname Warhawks because despite the risk, they knew it was the time to fight. Clay became Speaker of the House. He, along with other Warhawks and like-minded Republicans from the coastal states, put pressure on the Madison administration. Now, After years of resistance, Madison listened with and with the Congress vote, the War of 1812 had begun. America decided to stand up for Fort sovereignty on the sea and its security to the west. The Warhawks in Washington were enthusiastic about the declaration. I mean, like they were the world they were like really happy about the war. As so was Jackson in Tennessee. At last, he would have the chance to defend the nation he loved, to protect his family and friends, and personally to take revenge on the nation that had left him alone and scarred so many years before. A quarter century before, Jackson had swallowed his grudge when the Treaty of Paris and then made U.S. independence official in 1783. The orphaned 16-year-old adopted America as his family. Relatives had taken him in after his mother's death. He became a settler's apprentice. And then his ambitions rising, he clerked for a North Carolina attorney. Andrew Jackson's cobbled together upbringing would serve him well, though he also gained a reputation as a young man who loved drinking, playing cards, and horse racing. Admitted to the bar to practice law at age 20, a year later he accepted an appointment as a public prosecutor in North Carolina's Western District. That took him beyond the boundaries of the state to the other side of the Appalachians. Jackson arrived in a region that a few years after his arrival became the state of Tennessee. The red-haired, blue-eyed, and 86-foot one young man made an immediate impression in Nashville. And when I say Nashville, like, basically that's... I don't know, like, the capital of the state, but, like, when people think of Nashville, they all think Nashville, Tennessee, the home of the king, basically, basically, I'm trying to say, but like basically the home of country music. A frontier outpost established just 8 years earlier. As Jackson put down roots, he became one of its chief citizens. As his and the city's reputations grew, his race gained momentum after he met Rachel Dawson, the youngest daughter of one of Nashville's founding families. Dark-eyed Rachel was the prettiest of the Dawson sisters in full life. It was said she was the best storyteller and the best dancer, and the most dashing horsewoman in the western country. Jackson was smitten, and after the exhilarated and extracted herself from marriage already gone bad. He took her as his wife. As a lawyer, a trader, a merchant, Jackson bought and sold land by the time Tennessee joined the Union in 1796. He won the respect of his neighbors who chose him as their delegate to the state Constitution Convention. Jackson then served as a Tennessee's first congressman for one session before becoming a U.S. senator. But he found life in the political realm of the federal city frustrating. Too little got done for the decisive young Jackson, and he accepted an appointment to Tennessee Supreme Court in the early years of the 19th century. He divided his energies between administrating the law and establishing himself as this growing plantation, the Hermitage. 10 miles outside of Nashville, his house was the seat of hospitality, wrote a young officer friend, the resort of friends and acquaintances, and all other strangers in visiting the state. His next venture into public service would suit him better thanks to his strong relations and sound political instincts. He was elected Major General of the Tennessee Militia in February 1802, maintained by the state, not the federal government. The militia was provided by local men who supplied their own weapons and uniforms and short contracts for a few months' duration. Leading the militia was a good fit for Jackson's style because it gave him the chance to serve the people he loved with the freedom he needed and the challenge he craved. General Jackson repeatedly won re-election, as well as the deep loyalty of his men. They liked what he said. He was often outspoken, and many shared his uncompromising views of defending settlers' rights. With rumors of war, he was ready to defend his people and was just a man to rely on Westerners to the cause of American liberty. Citizens, he wrote in her broadside, your government has allowed us yield to impulse of a nation. Are we child slaves to George III, the military conscripts of Napoleon the Great, or the frozen peasants of the Russian Tsar? No, we are the free-born sons of America, the citizens of the only republic now existing in the world. Jackson understood the stakes of the war, and he recognized the strategy as only a Westerner could. Only critical importance to victory in the West was a port city near the Gulf Coast. Jackson was soon set his troops in the autumn of 1812. Every man of the western country turned his eye intently upon the mouth of the Mississippi. Together, he observed, we are committed by nature herself to defense of the lower Mississippi and the city of New Orleans. New Orleans was so important, in fact, that upon becoming president a dozen years earlier, Thomas Jefferson had made an acquiring a key attractive. organizing the city's singular strategic and strategic importance to his young nation hero. There is on the globe one single spot, the professor of which there is on the globe one single spot, the professor of which our natural and habitual enemy. It is New Orleans. Knowing that Napoleon's plan for extending his American empire has suffered a major setback in the Caribbean, where his expeditionary force had been decimated by yellow fever, Jefferson sensed an opportunity. He dispatched his friend James Monroe to Paris to instruct and to try to purchase New Orleans. Monroe had succeeded in an assignment beyond Jefferson's wildest dreams. Recognizing his resources were already overextended in his quest to dominate Europe, Napoleon agreed to sell all Louisiana that convened an immense wilderness to the United States, effectively doubling the size of the new country. The Louisiana Purchase had been completed in 1803 at a purchase of $15 million for more than 800,000 square miles of territory. The land had been staggered and bargained. The cost to make construction worked out to less than 3 cents an acre. The Louisiana city of New Orleans was the greatest gateway to and from the heart of the country. America's inland waterways, the trouble speaking today. The Ohio, the Missouri, and the numerous other rivers that emptied into the Mississippi amounted to an economic lifeline for farmers, trappers, and lumbermen upstream. On these waters, flatboats, keelboats were common sight, carrying manufactured goods from Pennsylvania, as well as crops, pellets, and logs from the burgeoning farms and reservoirs across the Ohio Valley, Cumberland Gap, and the Great Smoky Mountains. On reaching the waivers of warehouses and quays of New Orleans. The goods went aboard waiting ships to be transported all over the world, although Louisiana became a state in April 1812. I don't know why about saying 1912 because like April 1912, obviously that sounds like Titanic to me. But the British still questioned the legitimacy of America's ownership of the Louisiana territory. Napoleon had taken Louisiana from Spain, and to some Europeans it remained rightfully a possession of the Spanish crown. Jackson feared that shore thinking could provide the British with just the pretext they needed to interfere with the American experiment. Capturing New Orleans would be the perfect way to disrupt America's western expansion. Now that America had finally gone to war, many nagging practical questions hang in the air in Washington. Who would determine America's military strategy? Who would lead the nation to war? The generals of the Revolutionary were aging or dead. The passing of George Washington, first president, had sent the nation into mourning 13 years before, and no military leader had the stature to take up the general's place. Although the country had prevailed in the previous decade in the war on the Barbary coast of North Africa, defeating the pirate states that had attacked its shipping and held its men in hostage. This was a bigger fight for even bigger stakes. Although Mr. Madison nor members of Congress would know it in June of 1812, the burden of protecting the West would eventually settle into the narrow but resistant shoulders of General Andrew Jackson, a man little known and less liked outside his region. But first, Jackson had to convince the men of Washington that a general from the backwoods was the one to lead the fight that would be anything but easy. Chapter 2: How to Lose a War. Resolved that we consider the war against Great Britain under existing circumstances unnecessary. Citizens of Lincoln County, Maine, August 3rd, 1812. The Boston Evening Post soon dubbed the conflict Mr. Madison's War. With no template to follow, he is the first American president to ever sign a formal declaration of war. James Madison was largely on his own. There was nothing but battle-hardened but Madison, soft-spoken as well as well-short. He weighed perhaps 120 pounds. Gentle in manner, he was sickly and focused, with a face that bore the aged lines of a man of 61 years. He was a far cry. He was a far cry from the strategist George Washington had been, and had little choice when it came to military matters, but relied on the advice of his councilors, his cabinet. Many also lacked war experience. Much of their guidance turned out to be less than sound. His advisors agreed that attacking Canada, which remained part of the British Empire, would be a perfect way to launch a war with Great Britain to gain a key bargaining chip in the future treaty negotiations. Harry Clay, for one, believed a land war with the United States neighbor to the north would end with Canada at your feet. Madison, usually reliable friend Thomas Jefferson, added his advice from Monticello. He thought the capture of Canada a sure thing. The acquisition of Canada this year, he wrote, will be a mere matter of marching. All these words reflected the strong confidence among American politicians that Canada too would like to be a British rule and would become a liberty army from the United States. On the other hand, no one seemed to wonder what would happen if sending American troops north to invade Canada left the country's long coast unprotected, and a few seemed to be considering the bigger danger to the south. If the British took New Orleans, they could be hamstringing its economy and prepare to squeeze the young nation. If America wants to fight in Canada, it might well bring enough troops to win, according to several Westerners, mostly anti-Jackson, who wrote to Madison to volunteer their military assistant. Jackson suggested moving 2,500 of his men to Canada within 3 months, but Washington never issued the orders for Jackson's men to move. Jackson became increasingly certain that the East Coast men Madison had running the war effort were incompetent. Guiding the charge to Canada was Madison's Secretary of War. William Eustis, who had served as a regimental sergeant during the American Revolution, neither a strategist nor a soldier. Eustis lacked battle experience, and it soon showed. Within 6 months, everyone in Washington knew that Dr. Eustis was no better prepared than Madison to direct the nation's military affairs. Eustis' strategy had called for attacking Canada on 3 fronts. The first assault was to launch from Fort Detroit, was directed by another veteran of the Revolution, General William Hall, who had been in uniform for 30 years, who looked like a grandfather. He was with shocked of white hair, though he ordered to move the British at nearby Canadian Fort. He followed along with the community of women and children were bombarded by British guns. Hall surrendered Fort Detroit and the entire Northwestern Army of the United States to a British and Indian force half its size. The second assault opened in Niagara in October 1812. Also went badly wrong, this time because a lack of discipline within the American force when New York's militiamen refused to cross the Niagara River into Canada to reinforce Ohio troops fighting the British. 950 Ohio militiamen were taken prisoner. Despite for victory, Secretary of War Eustis placed all of his hope in the third assault order to Major General Henry Dearborn, another elderly warhorse who had seen combat in 3 decades. Eustis warned him that he needed good news in time for Washington. This January session in Congress must not meet without a victory to announce to them fighting in the vicinity of Lake Champlain. Dearborn and his men also failed. Some of his militiamen under his command refused to cross the border. I need to get another drink of water. those who did not march on Canada smirked, skirmished briefly with the enemy, only to find themselves with the coming darkness shooting at one another. They retreated from the British and their own friendly fire, ending the year's Canadian assault. So much for what John Randolph of Virginia had told his fellow congressmen would be a holiday campaign. With the arrival of the year 1813, James Madison knew his war strategy needed to change. The president felt embattled. Congress and the nation were deeply divided. During the congressional debates concerning the Declaration of War, Madison's party had called the conflicts necessary a second war of independence. On the other side of the aisle, Federalists regard going to war as a foolhardy and unnecessary. They had unanimously voted against the President's War Declaration. Though the war hawks had prevailed, with bad news for the front, the opposition voices only grew louder. There were too few troops to protect American cities, especially those on the coast, including Washington. The U.S. Navy had performed relatively well at sea, sinking a few British ships, but those victories meant that the 2 dozen warships of the American fleet were outnumbered at least 30 to 1 by the Royal Navy, and already had more enemy ships arriving to blockade American ports. Yet the divided Congress was often unwilling to fighting for the military. The North demonstrated by the refusal of the New England militiamen to fight in Canada was far from committed to the war. Farmer Jackson offered a solution to a problem of soldiers refusing to fight. I would hang all of them, even if Madison had the money and unity he needed. His military leaders were not what they should be. His generals were old. His secretary of war was incompetent, and the secretary of the Navy was usually intoxicated. As the year 1812 ended, Madison faced a painful truth. Those who wrote the military stories will surely wonder at the misguided way the United States had launched its second war of independence. Since a betrayal, both Tennessee Governor William Belt and his Commandant General Andrew Jackson saw immediate danger in the west of the British supported Indians, and Jackson took on July 3rd, just a day before Independence Day, 4th of July, was ready and willing to penetrate the Creek towns to attain surrender of the captive and captors. But Jackson's offer to Washington volunteering the service of his 2,500 Tennessee militiamen to serve the cause produced no orders to march for months. Jackson awaited word from the War Department. He could nothing but bide his time in the Hermitage, complaining angry about the old grannies in Washington. Only in November did he get word from Governor Blount, fighting on behalf of President Madison ordered Jackson to protect the territory of Mississippi Valley. Finally, the men in Washington were recognizing the needs of the West. Jackson was to assemble a force to protect New Orleans immediately to defend it from a likely British invasion. Jackson issued a call to arms and flooded farmers, planters, and businessmen, and many of them descendants of the Revolutionary War veterans, poured into Nashville. These volunteers, as their ranks would be called, were eager to fight for their country, to protect their homes, and serve General Jackson. Jackson had little time to organize and train his new recruits before they started for New Orleans in January 1813. Loaded into 30 boat section, more than 2,000 men floated down the Cumberland River, only to run into trouble. A cold snap blockaded the river with ice, delaying the troops for 4 days. The unusual severe weather also brought frequent rain, hail, and snow, making the troops miserable. Jackson himself fell ill with a severe pain in the neck and head, but he recovered. When the ice melted, the boats continued on, but not without an accident. The difficult passage took 5 weeks on, cost 1 boat and 3 lives. On reaching Natchez, Mississippi, 800 miles downriver from Nashville, Jackson and his officers made camp. They drilled their volunteers, and with each passing day grew more impatient, as in their instructed they waited. As instructed, they waited orders regarding their final push toward New Orleans. While encamped outside Natchez, Jackson took the opportunity to strengthen his relations with his officer corps. Chief among them was John Coffee, Jackson's old friend and sometimes British partner. Coffee was an imposing figure with shoulders broad as Jackson's or narrow, an ideal commander for Jackson's cavalry. There was another good man in Jackson's inner circle, including his chief aide-de-camp, Thomas Hart Benton, a young Nashville lawyer who had impressed Jackson with his diligence, and John Wright, a Virginian-born, educated writing skills, earned him the role of Jackson's secretary. Jackson also named William Carl, a Nashville shopowner, originally from Pennsylvania, to be brigadier inspector. The plot also allowed Jackson to begin the process of turning inexperienced volunteers into a fighting force. He and his officers watched their troops clean and tested their weapons. The men practiced packing and unpacking their kits in order to be ready to march on the moment's notice. To a man, they were eager to take on the British forces said to be bearing down on New Orleans. Finally, on March 5th, 1813, a much anticipated letter from the War Department arrived, only to humiliate and frustrate Jackson and his men, who had sacrificed their time, their money, and sunk their lives to defend New Orleans as a result of America's many failures in the early war. General John Armstrong had replaced William Isted as Secretary of War in January, and Armstrong had decided to upend all exit strategies on other side. General Armstrong had written concerning the Urquharts as dismissed from public service. Armstrong's focus would not be on the south, but on the east coast, where he thought the greatest liberty lay. At first, Jackson was confused about the misused meaning. Could Armstrong really be telling him to disband his army and turn back? But the brave imparted orders from the new Secretary of War left no room for interpretation. The relatives to abandon their plans to the foreigners on return of Jackson. Confusion gave away to shock and anger. The English had been bad, but this move from Armstrong scarcely seemed to improve. Not that Jackson would be happy to go, deeply devoted to Rachel, his wife of almost 20 years. He carried a miniature portrait of her with him. They daubed it on a 4-year-old Andrew Jr. The boy, the aging, and the childless couple had adopted their own when one of Rachel's sister-in-law's birthed twins in 1808. The journal would like nothing better than to be reunited with his family, but well, New Orleans, Australian Madison himself had parted years early. New Orleans held the key to the country on the west side of the Mississippi, who would protect the essential port if Jackson turned back. And what of the other military attractions on the Gulf Coast? For months, Jackson had argued that to defeat Great Britain, America needed to keep Florida's deep-water harbors out of British hands. Many of these small states along the Gulf remained under Spanish rule, and the British were forming an alliance with Spain in order to control the coast. Whoever held those forts was a threat to the likes of the Mobile, as well as to the ultimate prize, New Orleans. Yet in the face of what Jackson saw as an urgent need to protect the Gulf Coast and the mouth of the Mississippi, Secretary of War Armstrong had not issued battle orders. He told the general and his men to go home. Not only that, but Armstrong ordered specifically that Jackson was to confiscate his men's weapons and take measures delivered to James Wilkinson, the overall commander of the American forces in the West. It seemed Armstrong was asking Jackson to disband his army, disarmament, and lead them to find their way home as best they could. They would not be paid, nor would they be issued supplies. Jackson faced the limit. He must follow orders, but to do so would move his men and guide them. Like Jackson, many of them were sick. Unlike Jackson, many of them were young and experienced. Together, when commanded by a seasonal leader, they could defend themselves from the British and Indians, but alone and together they would be to prey. Abandoning Jackson was a tough man, but he wasn't cruel. Yes, he would obey the order to march home, but he must do it his way. He said, "Compressor by must or balance his shoulder wonder and fall, sacrifice to the tomahawk and scalping knife of the wilderness, are sick, left naked in the open field, and remain without supplies, without nourishment, or the earthly comfort." To do that, Jackson wrote, would he be chose their destruction that he simply would not do. But he had his choice. He would have led his men on to defend New Orleans since that simply would not do. If he had to choice, he would have led his men to defend New Orleans since he was eager to meet the invader to drive him back into the sea. He had promised his recruits they would do so together, but more immediately concerned was the well-being of his men and his charge. As ridiculous as it seemed, he would have to turn his men around and lead them back to Nashville in a long trek home. The 40-mile march Jackson had made as 14-year-old prisoner would not be the longest walk of his life. With no steamboat service to carry his army upstream against the current, Jackson and his Tennessee volunteers faced a long march, one that he would take them across 500 miles of rugged ground, much of it Indian country. On March 25th, 1813, they began the track, but not before Jackson wrote to his congressman, "As long as I have funds or credit, I will stick by my volunteers. I shall march them to Nashville or bury them with the honors of war. Should I die knowing that they will bury me," he wrote defiant letters to both Secretary War Armstrong and General Wilkinson. He could not abandon his troops. These brave men, at the call of their country, followed me to the field. I shall carefully march them back to their homes. Even I cannot believe that after inviting us to rally around the stranded of the country in its defense, you would dismiss us from service 800 miles from our home, without money, without supplies. It has to be a mistake, wrote Jackson as a dispirited men let down by the government, but only by their general march north. Illness spread through the ranks. Jackson soon had 150 men sick on the list, 50 of them so well they could not sit unassisted. Jackson managed to commandeer wagons to carry some of them, but the 11 he found were not enough. He ordered his officers to surrender their horses to the sick.
Who are you talking to?
I'm reading. He asked no less of himself, turning over his 3 horses and walking the volunteers were trouble these. "It is my duty," wrote Rachel, "to act as a father to the sick and to the well, to stay with them until I march them to Nashville." He walked alongside his men. They covered an average of 18 miles a day, and he insisted upon order and discipline, but he led by example. He revealed no fatigue. He urged his troops homeward, and they understood his concern for their safety and comfort. As he moved along the column, this man, though well known for his violent and As the Tipper appeared to his men beloved, humane, and fatherly. This is not where a man belongs to a testament, but what he loves him. One reported. At 46, he was older than most of his troops. His face lined, his hair mostly grey, but Jackson made no compliment as he marched. Despite his light build, he was an imposing presence with an erect posture. He did not need gold, epaulets, and other adornments or jewels in order to combine his authority. His intense blue eyes, people said, blazed when he was angry, but here Jackson was also the sympathetic man who urges his volunteers toward home and safety. Admiration for him soared among the ranks as it was reported that he was the final to shepherd them home, that he had reached into his own pocket to provide supplies. The men revered their general, who shared their hardships as they marched together towards Nashville. One of the way one soldier remarked upon this. Another assured that he was tough as hickory, said it allowed the comparison range true, and soon enough Mrs. Wood took calling their hickory, and eventually Old Hickory. The nickname would last a lifetime, long enough for artillery, great New Orleans adventure, medicine administrator judge the fear for the city's safety to be a false alarm this time, but the threat would surface again in 1814 when this natural later instrument would prove their military merged by fighting the hated British. In the meantime, another danger of the people of the West was brewing, as Jackson had feared. Getting into trouble in the region was growing more serious by the day. A warning factional Creeks called the Red Sticks, the tomahawk-like war clubs they carried painted red, had allied themselves with the British. Soon enough, Andrew Jackson would have to face them down. Chapter 3. Oh, there.